Welcome to Getting Personal, a monthly podcast diving deep into the stories of the heartbeat of HR. Brought to you by Compt, a global lifestyle benefits platform where companies empower employees with benefits and rewards they'll use and appreciate, whoever and wherever they are in life.
Today, I have with me Patrick Riecke, the founder of the Burnout Hub, an online platform helping healthcare workers and leaders build cultures that prevent burnout and promote well being. Drawing from his own story of burnout and recovery as a healthcare leader, Patrick speaks, coaches, and consults with organizations across the country to create healthier workplaces and promote personal recovery. Patrick, thank you for joining me today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on, Lauren.
So, you have spent well over a decade in healthcare leadership. Healthcare alone, I know, is a very challenging industry. My mom is a nurse. I have heard about the the woes of healthcare for the last 30 years. And I know that you've worked closely with people in crisis. So that's patients, families, doctors, nurses, everyone you could consider a frontline worker. So I know that burnout isn't theoretical for you, but it's personal. So when did you first realize that you were burning out? Because I think that will set up our tone for the rest of our conversation.
Yeah, and you're so right. And kudos to your mom for serving as a nurse for that long, because it's not an easy job. Nurses have perennially been considered the most trusted industry in the United States. I think they've been doing that survey for like 45 years, and nurses always number one through ups and downs and lots of twists and turns. So kudos
Yeah.
to her and the whole nursing industry. But yeah, healthcare is not easy. They call them trauma centers for a reason, right? Like
Hmm.
everything that happens there is difficult. And we always say, no one wakes up in the morning and thinks, hopefully, I get to go to the hospital today. Like
Yep.
that's not what they want to do. They don't want to be there. It's a grudge buy. You don't want to have to do it. The emergency room is not a place that people, want to sign up for most of the time. So yeah, I mean, in the best of times, which we're certainly well past the best of times for healthcare, but in the best of times, it was difficult. You're
Yeah.
seeing, people go through tough times. Obviously, if you're in a hospital setting or an ICU setting, a nursing home setting, a hospice setting, you're seeing people come to the end of their lives a lot of times. So I suppose when I wish that I could say, I'm going to tell you a story about when I got to the point of burnout, and I wish I could say with honesty that this is when I realized I was burnout. But like I think like a lot of leaders, a lot of high performing people, you just keep going through, even when your body's yelling at you and telling you that something's wrong. So for me, I'd been in healthcare leadership for a long time, then came into the pandemic. And I led one team that responded to every single inpatient death in our hospital.
Mm.
So across, 8 different hospitals, we responded and showed up in person to every time a patient died. So that's heavy. There's not a lot
Yeah.
of people that want to sign up for that job, even if there's not a worldwide pandemic going on. Um, but then when the pandemic came, everything, of course, ramped up. My other role was with our ethics committee and leading our ethics committee, writing policies on healthcare policy, healthcare ethics. What do we do when we get to the last ventilator? What do we do when we get to the last room? What do we do when we don't have enough nurses to staff the rooms where these patients are during a worldwide pandemic? So intense stuff by
Yeah.
any measure. And I think like a lot of healthcare leaders and others, I just got to it. When the pandemic started, we were working 60, 70-hour weeks, and just really nose to the grindstone. We knew we had a mission. We knew we were trying to flatten that curve, trying to protect our coworkers, trying to figure out what was going on. The clinicians trying to figure out how to treat the patients, of course. And so you just worked really hard for a long time with things changing every day, and you're watching these reports and different reactions to everything. So our team that responded to patient deaths, we got to a point where we were averaging more than 9 patient deaths every single day. So it's a small team, and doing all these responses in person. And again, it was always difficult, even the best of times. But now with that sort of volume ramping up, and we're all human beings, right? So you're seeing what even if it's elderly people who are facing the end of their lives, or if it's little kids, babies, moms that are expecting that sort of thing, and everything in between. So watching my team go through that and watching some of them, of course, face burnout, secondary trauma, compassion fatigue through that time. And the whole time, though, I'm just supporting them. I'm focused on them. I'm serving them, And I felt like that was a privilege to be able to do that. But fast forward to the end of the pandemic, kind of right at what I would consider medically the end of the pandemic in the fall of 2022. I woke up one day and I could tell something was wrong with my body. I started watching my heart rate and it was going up and it was going down and all over the place. So I did what a lot of healthcare people do. I completely ignored anything
Yep.
was going on. So we went, I'm sure your mom's been in those situations before. It's like,
Yes.
I know what it is. I don't need to go in and tell them tell me what it is. So we went out to lunch. It was my birthday. So we went out to lunch, did the Mexican restaurant thing that we love to do on everybody's birthdays. And about 2:30 that afternoon, my smartwatch actually alarmed and said, you may be experiencing symptoms of AFib. And so
Oh,
at that point, I couldn't really ignore it any longer. So I went into the hospital that I worked into the ER, and they hooked me up to the machines and said, sure enough, you're in a persistent irregular heart rhythm for the first time. So the doctor looked at me. So what we do for people in your situation is we cardiovert you. Now, I didn't know what that word meant right off the bat. I'd been in healthcare a long time. I knew some of the healthcare words, but not all of them. So I said, "What does that mean?" He said, "We're going to shock you." I said, "Okay." And so I'm wide awake. I wasn't having chest pains. I wasn't having a heart attack, anything like that. And but he said, "We're gonna hook the crash card up to you." Well, I knew about the crash card. I'd seen that plenty of times in traumas and after medical situations. And so we'll probably sedate you. And so we had a long conversation about whether or not I should be sedated. They were all for it. And I said, I don't think I'll take the sedation. I'll take the shock wide awake. A decision my therapist later said was not the best,
sitting
the
here
best
like, are you
decision.
sure?
And your mom would probably shake her head even more. Nurses always roll their eyes at this part. This is a bad
Yeah.
idea. But regardless, that's what I did. And so it hooked me all up. And a little bit later, I'm hearing that word that I knew was coming, but wasn't quite prepared for. And the doctor said, clear. And boom, my all my appendages came up off the bed, slammed back down. What I found out 6 months after that, Lauren, was that was what my cardiologist described as vaguely mediated AFib, meaning that my vagus nerve had become so shot with all the stress over the 2.5 years of the pandemic and leadership and everything else that it actually thrown my heart out of rhythm.
Yeah. That is, oh my gosh. Wow, what a story. My mind is racing because not only is my mom a nurse, but worked in cardiac for congestive heart failure for years.
So you've heard plenty of stories.
Yes. So you're saying AFib. I'm like, oh no, I know where this is going. And interestingly, has also experienced a regular heartbeat because of
Mm,
stress. Same kind of thing. When you are in healthcare, or apparently related to someone in healthcare, you tend to ignore your symptoms and then Google them and then panic a little bit and then say, well, it's not that bad. I don't want to drain the emergency room's resources if I'm not in a true emergency.
right. Right.
But I mean, it can happen to you. It's not just burnout. It's not just I need a nap or I need a vacation or I need, a couple days off of work with a good healthcare routine or a good, meal. I need to work out a little bit. I mean, it's more than just being tired. It's more than just being just theoretically unwell. I know that a lot of people talk about burnout as like a disconnect, something that is happening uh, either in your work or in your personal life. You can feel disconnected from your purpose, and almost kind of experience this. I don't know. It's like a midlife crisis at any point in your life. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
want to hear your thoughts on the difference between exhaustion and burnout, because I think that's something that you can really speak to here.
Yeah, I think it is like a midlife crisis or an identity crisis, maybe, because
Yeah.
identity really does get tied up in it. When you say I'm a nurse or I'm a doctor or I'm a healthcare leader or something like that. Any of these roles that get tied in with our identity, then when we get burned out and we're not sure we've got the energy to do that thing anymore, there's actually a big similarity here between pastors and physicians because it's so much an identity thing for them. but any of us can identify with our job. Of course, we put those titles in our LinkedIn profile or wherever else, or when we meet people, what do you do? Well, I'm this or I'm that. I'm a teacher. I'm a professor. Whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
And then when we burn out and we feel like we can't do it anymore, it's like, well, then who am I? What am I going to do if I can't tell people this is what I do anymore? So, but it's a good question. We've all had the opportunity to work so hard that we were physically exhausted. I think that's actually I would say a blessing to work so hard that you're physically exhausted. But the question at that point is can I do the things you described? Can I go home? Can I take a nap? Can I rest, have a nice long weekend or a vacation or something like that, and then come back feeling renewed? If the answer is yes, you were simply physically exhausted. If the
Mm.
answer is no, you take that time away and you come back and you still feel all of your emotional reserves are drained. That's that first characteristic of burnout is emotional exhaustion, where even after a time of rest, you don't feel as though you have any interest in the work. You don't have any sort of drive for the work anymore. Most of these people, it's very unfamiliar because we've had drive, we've had passion for this for so long. And now it's like, why don't I feel any energy for this anymore? So that's where I would start is that emotional exhaustion. And then we go into the question of cynicism, or the presence of cynicism, where we're not just skeptical, we're not just sarcastic. A lot of us are sarcastic, but we're truly cynical, where we don't see any good happening any longer. We just anticipate every new thing at work is going to be bad. Every new hire is going to make things worse. Every new policy change is going to make things worse. And then the biggest manifestation you hinted at, Lauren, is that the experience of I don't really know what I'm doing here anymore. I don't really know if I'm making a difference. Am I really making, is there meaning here? This lost sense of purpose where I feel disconnected from what I'm doing. And the wild thing is people around you might still be saying, well, Lauren, you're doing such a great job. You're making such a difference. This is so wonderful. But if you don't feel it, then that's when that's a marker of burnout for you. Even if everybody's telling you you're doing a great job, you're making a difference. If you don't feel it, that's a signal it's gone beyond just I'm tired from a long work day.
Sure. I completely uh resonate with that. And now that I am so many years past experiencing it myself, hindsight is 2020. When I was working in TV news, I was living in Salt Lake City at a time. It was a really difficult year. And then I started getting sick all the time.
Mm.
I thought, well, new environment, lots of hours, I'm just tired, I'm not resting well. But it went beyond like a head cold. I got the flu, and then I got pneumonia, and then I got shingles. And I was like, I'm not even 25. Who gets shingles at this age? It was ridiculous. And it was really a moment in time for me where I had to reflect and think to myself, is this worth it anymore? Because my identity was so wrapped up in my career
Oh,
choice. I had spent so many years studying and working and interning to do this very specific thing. And I didn't know what life was going to look like on the other side of that. I'm so glad that I'm not in that boat anymore now. But at the time, it was really hard for me to recognize these maybe like early indications, early signs within myself that I was not just losing energy, but like on a path to burnout. And maybe it's easier to recognize it in other people instead of ourselves. I know you touched on some of the early signs, but what else does this look like that someone is not just losing energy, but they are on a dangerous path?
yeah. Yeah, I think you're 100% right. It's so much easier to see in the rearview mirror and realize for ourselves that a colleague of mine who's a PR person, and she said, I look back at there was a time she had basically like a whole breakdown, physical, mental breakdown, and her response to that was that she just needed to dial in and work harder. And
Yep.
she's like, now in retrospect, I realized that was crazy, a crazy response, a very unhelpful response to where I was, but I think it's a common response, where we just
Mhm.
want to dial down and we want to work harder. We're going to do better. We're going to show everybody we've still got what it takes, that sort of thing. Um, because there's the identity that where we're attached to our title that we talked about, but there's also the identity of I can do it.
Yeah.
I'm capable. I'm good at this. I'm helpful. I'm strong. I'm the one people can go to. that sometimes is tied to our actual job title, but a lot of times it's just tied to who we are as a human being in the places where we show up to work. And when we start to feel like we can't do those things anymore, then we do. A lot of times we sort of double down on that. I think we lack clarity on burnout when it's ourselves. We might have pretty good clarity for others, like you said, but we lack it for ourselves. So I developed a really quick test. There's a lot of really academic tests that sometimes you have to pay for, and they're a little bit hard to understand. So I developed an easier test. It's at myburnouttest.com. And if anybody wants to go to myburnouttest.com, it's a very quick check to say, it's not going to tell you you are burned out, you are depressed, something like that, but it's going to give you an indication. Are you at high risk right now, moderate risk, or low risk for burnout? Based on those basic characteristics and mitigators of burnout. And I think that's helpful for people when they're looking at themselves because again, it's hard to assess for ourselves. I'm a very reflective person. Before I was in
Right.
healthcare, I was in nonprofit and ministry where we're doing reflective exercises. I've written books that contain, self-reflection, et cetera, et cetera. I go to therapy. Like I try to be very in tune with who I am. I completely missed that I was burned out. So there's lots of smart people, lots of capable people, reflective people who've missed it completely about themselves. And so having some tests like this, it's like a depression screening. It's
Yeah.
important to go on and sort of assess ourselves. So yeah, for anybody that's maybe tipping in that direction or wondering where they're at right now, I start with that screening. And then if you've got a colleague you're worried about too, then maybe just subtly get that link over to them too so they can assess themselves.
Work is such a huge part of our lives, but it also is a huge energy drain. I know that some of your work includes talking about energy leaks at work. So these are the things that you say quietly drain us. So it's not necessarily oh, I have 5 projects due this week. That's the obvious stuff. So what do you think drains people more than they realize?
Yeah, I always encourage everybody to look at their schedule. If you're a professional that has, you live by Outlook or your Apple Calendar or whatever, and these are all my meetings, these are all my repeating meetings, these are my one-on-ones, et cetera, et cetera. These are the committees I'm a part of to look at that and say which one of these are draining my energy. And the thing is, your body already knows, kind of along the lines of what we've talked about the body telling that story. Your body already knows. So when you go into that meeting or you think about that task or that committee or whatever, and you feel your shoulders kind of tense up or your heart rate quickens, and you've got some of these stress responses, to bring that from the biological level into the conscious level and say, oh, apparently this committee meeting really just gets me upset. So once you've identified it, you can do one of two things. The first thing is to ask yourself, do I actually have to keep doing this? Because we do so many things at work, right? Out of habit. Like, this is what I've always done. I always show up to this thing. I always go to this committee. I've been on it for 100 years, but I just keep going and I'm not sure
Mhm.
why. And it always stresses me out. So, like, asking yourself, do I actually have to do the thing? Could I pass it off to somebody else? What if I didn't show up for this meeting that I don't enjoy? What if I just got the minutes later? And then if you do have to continue actually participating in it, I used to, and I'm sure I'm the only person that's ever done this, but I'd stress about that meeting that I didn't like for days beforehand.
Yeah. It's the same concept as the Sunday scaries, when it's
Yes,
Sunday, but you're not maybe looking forward to Monday. You log in on a Monday, you see that calendar on Thursday, and you expect it every Thursday, but you're like, oh no, that's coming up.
exactly, exactly. So what I recommend with those is don't try to convince yourself that the meeting's going to be great. Our brains are smart; and they can't be fooled by mantras that are not honest. So accept that you're probably not going to enjoy the meeting, but try to not give it energy until you're in that space, and then allow it to drain you for the hour, or the half hour, the 2 hours that you're in that meeting, and then step away and have some ritual where you say that meeting was stressful and now it's over and I'm going to move on to other things. Just identify that. Can I opt out of it? Can I send somebody else? Can I just get the notes? If I can't, then how do I draw a line around it to make sure it's not ruining my whole week?
Sure. I think there's so much worth sitting and evaluating if like a meeting or something else on your calendar is still worth your time. It served a value at some point when it was originally put on your calendar, but now maybe that meeting could be an email. You
Yeah,
never know.
for sure. Yeah, we talk about like the mop bucket in the corner. You know, if you walked into somebody's office tomorrow and they had a empty, a mop bucket sitting there, and you hear the water sloshing around in it or whatever, you'd notice it immediately. But if that became your office and you worked there for 3 years, you would never see the mop bucket anymore. And there's so many things like that for work, like you said, that just become habits. And to pull those out, to look under them, why am I still doing this? Is there an agenda for this meeting, or are we just getting together? You know, even for what we're doing right now, Lauren, you put together a great agenda. These are things we're going to talk about, kind of lead us through that time, help me to have some clarity. But a lot of times we miss that point and we just
Yeah.
keep doing things out of habit, and it's draining our energy little by little over time.
A lot of this, I think, happens at the personal level or even like interpersonal level, you and your coworkers, especially since there are so many times at work where you create friendships and you can recognize these things in other people. And maybe that there's a safe space to talk about these things. But this also becomes organizational. We see burnout having a huge impact on culture and just the collective. So, what do you think organizations are still getting wrong about burnout? I know from my perspective, people are trying to slap a wellness stipend onto things and say, okay, we've done it. We've fixed burnout. And that's just not the case.
You know, it's those wellness programs are either amplify the care that people already feel from the organization, or they're salt on the wound because they're trying to just use it as that band aid, right? There's really no such thing as a neutral well being program. You know, if you've got a great organizational culture,
Mhm.
meaning that people feel supported, they feel safe. They feel like they belong. This is an important part of DEI, right? Is belonging, not just, okay, you recognize that I'm different, but I feel like I belong, even though I'm not the same as everybody else, where I feel like I belong. And really just where I feel like my leader listens to the things I have to say,
Yeah.
whether it's about, the process improvement and what we're doing here and asking questions, or it's I come in and say, you know what? Tough day. My dog died over the weekend, or really tough day. My grandpa died over the weekend, and I feel like I'm listened to in that regard. What do I think organizations are getting wrong? I think they're treating burnout still as just stress. Where people are just stressed. And so if we can do some things that make people feel a little bit better, we're gonna have a mindfulness session, we're gonna have yoga, we're gonna do the pizza party on Friday. Hopefully that'll be fun and that'll reduce people's stress. Burnout is not a side item anymore.
Uh-huh.
It's the main entree. It's something that, especially in healthcare, but in other industries too, like K-12 and higher ed and even retail, where you're looking at almost always more than half of the people are experiencing burnout on some level. You know, if I told you that in healthcare, over half of nurses have the flu right now, you say all stop. We've got to do something about this. This is not healthy for them. It's not healthy for the patients. This is really scary. I can't believe there's that many nurses. But if I told you that over half of them are feeling burned out and feel like they've lost their purpose, they feel like they don't have any energy, then we just say, well, yeah, that's kind of the way it goes. And we're looking at it as this, we want to do other things to try to that don't really directly deal with burnout, but hopefully they're going to have this side effect that's going to cure burnout. It's too big and too complex of a problem to deal with as a side effect any longer.
That's interesting. I am thinking of how I've heard people describe healthcare, for instance, or teaching or other quote unquote thankless jobs. Um, And they often describe it as just inherently stressful. Like, well, that's the nature of it. And I understand what you're saying when organizations are trying to prescribe some stress relief instead of, no, this is burnout. This is like a systemic issue. This isn't just a moment in time that can be alleviated with like a Friday luncheon. Huh.
Yeah, I think of one tiny example that illustrates that so well. We had a nurse who is just being berated by a patient, talked up one side and down the other. Lots of colorful language, lots of character assassination. You're just a bad person. You just want me to blah blah blah. And this is something that has always happened to nurses. You know, it's always been an experience. Workplace violence, of course, is
Yeah.
a huge concern in healthcare. Um, one of our chaplains was on duty with her, was trying to give her some encouragement. There was an ethics consult, so they got me on the phone to have the ethics consult. And I'm talking to the nurse and I'm listening to how she's been treated. And you could tell like she's shook, but she's like you said, well, that's just part of the job. And so she's just doing what she's doing. And finally I said, before we get off the phone, I said, let me just say, you don't deserve to be treated this way. And you could hear just the emotions start to come through for her and the tears. I said, nobody deserves you don't there's no sort of like get out of jail free card just because this is a nurse, I get to talk to her this way.
Right.
And you shouldn't be talked to this way. And I'm sorry that you as a human being with worth and dignity that you've been treated this way. Did that solve the problem? Did that mean she's never going to be talked to poorly again? No, but it's one of those things where it said, we said to each other, yes, this is something that happens, but that doesn't mean that it's okay.
Yeah. Sometimes the recognition alone is just I don't know, like a I don't want to say that it's like a miracle cure because it really isn't, but it is something that helps like alleviate even just the sharpness, I guess, of
Yeah.
those moments. And I'm sure that's something that's stuck with her also. I mean, I know there are so many moments in my career where just being heard, like when I was trying to figure out, well, now I don't want to do this career anymore that we spent money in college for, and I have a degree, and what am I going to do with that? Calling upon the people that I trusted and mentors who were just like validated how I was feeling and said, there's life on the other side. You can work a 9 to 5. Like you don't have to be awake at 2 in the morning, standing on the side of the road at some kind of whatever scene, writing down your notes furiously. Like you can have Thanksgiving with your family again. And it's, funny looking back at it, not in like a funny haha necessarily, but it's amazing that we allow ourselves to get to that point and experiencing burnout because when we see it happen to other people we're more likely to say, well, I would never let that happen to me. I would recognize the signs in myself, but that's never the case.
Nope. Nope. It's almost never the case. And I think, going back to your point, if I could wave a magic wand today and change one thing about healthcare and other industries, like I said, those thankless jobs, it'd be to remind every leader that just listening and being quiet and shutting our mouths for a little while the person talks. We're so scared that they're going to bring up something that they're not happy about and we're not going to be able to change it. And guess what? We're right. We can't change it. These are sometimes there's things that we can change and we should do the things that we can do as leaders. But I guarantee you, when a teacher comes in after a stressful day, my wife works as a teacher and one of her colleagues the other day had a kid take a swing at her and try to punch her. Well, you can't bring that teacher in and say, we're going to guarantee that will never happen again. We're going to fix that problem. Like she knows that would not be honest, but to bring her in and say, I'm really sorry that you had to deal with that today. Tell me about how you're doing. And to let her talk and get her feelings out and feel like she's heard by a leader again, it's not a magic wand. It's not going to actually solve everything, but it is so significant that she's going to feel seen and heard. I mean, we all know we've all gone through difficult things, whether it's burnout or trauma or grief or death. If there were people around us that supported us during that time, we buoyed up much more quickly afterwards.
Yeah.
If we didn't had to do it alone, it felt like nobody was watching, nobody cared. It makes it much more difficult.
Well, you really are an expert in this, considering you work in healthcare and your wife works in education. The two of you really understand what it's like to experience stress and burnout. And that said, for someone who might be listening, experiencing burnout, or maybe they're starting to recognize some of these early symptoms, early indicators that they're heading in that direction, what do you recommend as a first step to trying to get out of it? What does recovery look like? Even while you're working, because realistically, we can't just take a sabbatical. There are so many people who really rely on their salary or don't have the kind of paid leave that they would need to maybe step away and figure all this out for themselves.
Yeah, for sure. And that was I did a little bit of both. I stayed on the job for another 13 months after that. So I spent some of that time trying to figure out like how do I recover while I'm still doing the thing. And then eventually to step away to do what I'm doing now and kind of address burnout, full time. So the first thing I would say is learn to say no at work. This is really hard, especially for
Is.
people who burned out. Usually it's because they cared so much initially and they're so invested and they're responsible and they want to help and they want to further the mission and all of that. And we get in the habit of raising our hand. I can help with that. I can help with that. I can help with that. Very few burned out people are still working within the confines of their job description.
Hmm.
They're doing all of the extra things. And telling them to say no or to just not volunteer at work for those extra things. And we still have to do the core elements of our job. If you're a nurse, you still have to pass meds, you still have to take care of that patient, of course. If you're a teacher, you still have to teach the students. But there's so many other things, extra things that these people volunteer for. And to just start to analyze that and say, why am I raising my hand? Should I continue to raise my hand? Is there anything? Can I retreat back into roughly the confines of what my job description looks like? So the first thing I would say is to say no at work. And then second of all, I would say begin to say yes to yourself. And what am I going to do that I want to do? I still matter, and so, what are the things? Do I want to develop a hobby, get back into a hobby? One of the things I always recommend for people that are struggling with burnout, and this sounds really pie in the sky, but is a bucket list because a bucket list overtly says, this is something I want to do. Here's the crazy thing. When I started talking about bucket lists, I started asking at these events where all these healthcare leaders were. I used to ask them like, or I still do ask, how many of you have a bucket list? And I'd see like less than 5% of the room would raise their hand and say bucket, and that they had a bucket list recorded someplace. So I figured that just must be the way it goes in the United States. There's only maybe about 5%. And then I started looking at some articles that showed like 40 to 60% of the general population has a bucket list recorded someplace. And
Where are
I don't
these
know how
people?
accurate those are, but they're definitely very different than the 5% I was seeing. And I was like, oh, there's actually a big gap here of these people are being so responsible. They're caring for other people so much of the time that they've lost their own interests. They've lost anything that they want to pursue themselves. They retire and they don't know what to do with themselves because they've been so focused on everybody else. So when we look at the bucket list, we're starting to infuse a little bit of energy back into the things that we want to do because it's not binary, right? It's not either you care about your work or you care about yourself. Like it's possible to do both. So saying no to some of those things at work and then starting to say yes to some of the things you want to do, spending time with friends, finding your hobbies, making that bucket list, invest. And that's where self care doesn't actually fix burnout. But without making some choices for yourself, certainly burnout's going to get worse.
It's interesting how caregivers over-index on the caregiving for other people and then forget about themselves. And really, it's taking just those small things and small moments and then practicing those. And then you can do more over time. And then maybe you work your way up to the bucket list and then you cross your things off your bucket list. Like it's just pick the one hobby that doesn't feel like it's going to just crush you or like suck all of the free time that you feel like you maybe don't even have because you're working 312s or whatever that looks like
Right.
and you're exhausted, and start small. Or if you're the kind of person that maybe you are really driven by like OKRs. You want to set an objective and a goal and whatever your results look like, and you want to cross those items off the list. And if that's the way that you have to do it or rewire your brain to get to that place, then that's what you got to do. I think
Yep.
it looks a little bit different for everyone, so it's hard to prescribe like, well, this is what you can do. But I think starting small and remembering to say no and to put yourself first is the right steps.
Yeah, for sure. There's a leader, a healthcare leader that I talked with this early this summer, and we did the bucket list thing. What would you put on your bucket list? And I always remind people, like you said, it doesn't have to be go to Italy and go skydiving. Like it can be something very small, very simple. And she had three little kids. She said, "I want to go to a zoo that's not the local zoo that's here in our town." She wanted to drive someplace and go to a zoo. Well, that's now she has three small children, so it's still no small feat to get to that zoo and survive the zoo. But a
Yeah.
few weeks later, she sent me some pictures of them at this zoo that they drove to a couple hours away. And the zoo's awesome. The zoo's fun and they had a great time. But for her to say, this is something I want to do and then pursue it, that's really where the magic
It's
comes
huge.
in.
So if we look back in order to look forward. We have 2024 was the year of quiet quitting. 2025 is productivity pressure. Everyone's burning out. What do you think 2026 will be? Are we heading in the right direction? Are people going to start taking care of themselves?
That's a good question that I'm not sure I can give a positive answer to. You know, a lot of the numbers are still continuing to decline for burnout. We're seeing some improvement in some areas, but overall, there's still an incline. I think 2026 needs to be the year of show me the meaning. You know, what's the meaning? What's the meaning of what I'm doing at work? How do I connect to that? People lose track. Like, okay, we know this is the mission of our organization. This is what we're trying to do. These big goals. What do the small stuff that I do every day, how does that connect with the bigger meaning at work?
Yeah.
And as leaders, we might see it. We might think, well, obviously my direct reports see it. Obviously, the people working in this industry see how for the nurse when she passes the meds accurately and on time, surely she sees how that connects to the greater purpose of providing excellent patient care. But probably not. You know, she's doing it because it's the right thing to do. But for you as a nurse manager, or somebody to come along and say, the accuracy that you charted that interaction with helps us to tell the patient's story. Being able to tell the patient's story helps us to provide them with excellent care. Little ways like that of connecting to the meaning of the organization, and then the meaning of our own lives too. Like, what does my life mean? Can What does it mean that I work here? Am I getting invested in? Do people care about me? Am I on a path to where I want to go? So we're so disillusioned, I think, right now with so many different things, and we've lost trust in so many different entities and AI and deep fakes, all this stuff that's going on all the time. We start to ask ourselves, what's real? What can I really hold on to? What really has meaning? And I think we can help our coworkers as leaders. And then I think for ourselves, we want to find meaning. What does this mean for me?
You said something there that I think is especially important. The direct managers, leaders, whoever it may be, just taking a moment to make those things visible. Because I think people are you're just doing your job. You just think, like, well, this is part of my job. Of course, I'm going to give this person whatever prescribed medicine they need. Of course, I'm going to teach these kids their ABCs. Of course, I'm going to finish this project by the deadline. Um, and that's just part of my job. So it can be hard to see the greater picture of how those things tie into the meaning or purpose of an organization. And leaders, managers are so critical in creating those connections and pointing them out to people, because it can be hard to see that in the day to day. Speaking of leaders doing things meaningfully for their teams, if they are trying to start off on the right foot in January and protect their teams from burnout throughout the year, or which might actually just be impossible. Protecting people from burnout might not be realistic, this question. But what can they do to at least set people up for success, make sure they're checking in with themselves or with each other, and try their best to prevent burnout?
Yeah. So this is going to be heavy, but also I think is going to have a lot of implications for leaders. UKG Workforce did a study a while back about the mental health impact of different people in our lives, and there's two roles in our lives that came out tied for number one, and that was our partner at home and our manager at work. 69% of people saying that those two roles have the most significant impact on their own mental health. And I don't think very many leaders got into their field because they wanted to have an impact on people's mental health that reported to them. Like you said, they want to get the project done, they want to do the work right. But I think recognizing that as leaders at work, managers at work, we have a primary, really the primary, tied with that partner at home, the primary role in these people's mental health. So measuring what we're doing and how we're interacting with our team, that doesn't mean you have to be nice all the time. Doesn't mean you can't discipline people. Doesn't mean you don't have expectations, hold people accountable, etc. But just to take your role as more significant than just we're trying to get this end result or this metric met. But I'm also sort of a caretaker of these people, investing in them, allowing them to feel seen and heard and cared about, and then putting yourself in their shoes and saying, if I was in their shoes, what would I want?
Mhm.
How would if I come into a new organization and I think I'd like to invest in my retirement fund, or I'd like to take care of or take advantage of my comp benefit, but I'm not quite sure how to do that remember that at some point, you as a leader, you didn't know how to do it either, and helping them to be able to see that. But yeah, making those connections to say, I have a really significant role to play, not just in the work life or the productivity or the financial status of my coworkers, but also in their mental health.
Amazing. Patrick, I so appreciate your time today. If people want to reach out and use some of your services, talk to you about burnout and how to prevent it in the workplace, where can they find you?
Yeah, myburnout.test.com is a great place to start. You're going to find that test and then links to all the different resources. One of the primary ones that I think is in the spirit of Comp too is we just developed an online platform called myburnout.hub.com or the Burnout Hub. And it's got all sorts of resources that really takes a direct look into the abyss that is
Yeah.
burnout. That helps people kind of in two ways. Well, two focuses. One is the personal recovery. What do I do for myself? And then the other side is what we've talked about, the leadership training. How do I sort of burnout proof as much as I can my leadership and my team? So that platform I think is really, it's got a ton of resources. Got like 27 different downloadable PDFs, especially on that leadership side. We always love a good PDF that gives us kind of a way to go forward with our team. So fantastic resource there too. So either myburnouttest.com or myburnouthub.com.
Fantastic. I'm going to go check that out. I think I'm going to take the burnout test every month just in case.
Not a bad idea. Can go up and down from time to time.
Thanks, Patrick.
Thanks, Lauren.
Thanks for joining us on Getting Personal, brought to you by lifestyle benefits experts at Compt. Remember, you can always find more stories and helpful insights on our LinkedIn and blog.